Hey guys, this is Mr. Ferreter, and as you know, this week we are studying fossils. Just to get some logistics out of the way, if you're interested in opening these slides or referring to them later, or if you want to get access to the note sheet that you have to complete for this particular video, you can find links to both posted in the session description of this video or posted inside of Google Classroom. The note sheet, super easy. You've seen these before. It's a fill-in-the-blank note sheet with a word bank. All I want you to do is be able to create a reference document that you can use to go back and study important fossil concepts later. Does that make sense to everybody? So there you go. There's the beginning and the logistics out of the way, and let's start talking about fossils. Now, if you're anything like me, my bet is that you've always been fascinated by fossils, particularly when you were a kid. And that makes perfect sense if you think about it, because fossils are just plain cool. I mean, if you go to Google and you pull up a collection of images about fossils and you look around, there's nothing there that isn't fun to look at. I've always been fascinated by fossils too. I'm the guy that goes to the Museum of Natural Science and spends all kinds of time looking at the fossils of different dinosaurs and animals from the past. There's just something really cool about thinking about the fact that these animals actually existed and lived on Earth, and that we can see a record of them and of what their bodies and structures looked like. But if I'm being completely honest with you, I would have to tell you that at least until I started to teach this particular unit, I never really understood why fossils were important. I mean, I knew that they were cool, but why do they matter? And that's what this whole entire lesson is all about, so please pay a little bit of attention so that you can figure out why we should care about fossils beyond the fact that they're just fun to look at. So when we talk about studying fossils, one of the very first things that I learned is that fossils are used as evidence of changes on the Earth. That's why paleontologists and archaeologists and all kinds of scientists love to look back at the fossil record. When we look at the fossil record, we're able to see how things have changed over the course of time by studying the remains of plants and animals that are stored inside of the fossil record. That's what makes them so important. And you guys know the surface of the Earth and our climate has changed over the course of millions of years multiple times. So how do we learn more about what those changes were and the impact that those changes had on the plants and animals on Earth? Well, the answer is we start looking at the fossilized remains of those plants and animals, and we see how they've changed over time. Let me say it more simply for you. Fossils give us some hints about the diversity of living things that were living on our planet. And by looking at the unique structures of those living things, both plants and animals, we can get some hints or some ideas about what the conditions on Earth must have been like in order for those living things to have been able to survive. Do you guys get that? So fossils become proof of what the conditions on Earth were like. And studying the conditions on Earth millions of years ago is impossible without looking back at the fossil record. So let's talk for a second or two about some specific types of fossils that we find in the fossil record. And that was something that was new to me too. I didn't know this, but there are several different types of fossils. And the different types of fossils that you find are dependent on the environmental conditions that the fossils were formed in. And if you remember the video that you watched to start our particular study of fossils, one of the things that helps with the formation of fossils is lots and lots of sediment building up. And one particular type of fossil that you'll find in sediment-rich areas are called mold fossils. So a mold fossil forms when lots of sediment actually buries a dead organism. So if there is a fish at the bottom of a lake, and that lake forms lots of sediment and buries the remains of a dead fish, a mold fossil might form. Now, what's interesting about the mold fossil is the sediment will bury the dead plant or animal completely, And then that dead plant or animal will decay inside of the sediment. And what's left behind is sort of a cavity or an opening that has the pressed remains of the body of the organism inside of it. Do you get that? So what you're seeing here in this particular picture is there was a shell there at one point or another. The shell decayed over time, but it left an imprint of what it looked like, a cavity inside of sediment that solidified in rock. So this is basically a mold of what that animal once looked like. Related to mold fossils are what are called cast fossils. Now, a cast fossil is formed in much the same way. An organism is buried by sediment. The organism decays away, leaving a cavity behind. But sometimes that cavity that was left behind ends up becoming filled with sand or mud that will harden into the shape of the original organism. Now, if you think about it, a cast fossil is really a neat look at what the outside of an organism once looked like, but it doesn't tell us very much about the inside of the organism. And I think that's true for mold fossils too. What we're seeing is what the outside shape of the organism originally looked like. It's an impression or an interpretation or a view as to what the outside structures of an organism looked like. And by the way, that's super helpful to us, right? Because by looking at the structure of individual organisms, we can oftentimes make conclusions about the environment that those organisms lived in. Because every organism is uniquely structured to survive and thrive and reproduce within its particular environment. So by looking at external structures, something that mold fossils and cast fossils allow us to do, then we're able to make some conclusions about the environment based on the structure of the organisms that we're looking at. Everybody get that? So let's look at two more types of fossils. Another type of fossil is called a petrified fossil. Now here's what happens with a petrified fossil. An organism dies, living organism, plant or animal, and the remains of that organism are buried completely. Now, once the organism is buried completely, minerals soak into those buried remains and they replace the remains completely. And then those remains solidify into a form of rock. So what you're looking at in this particular picture are not the actual remains of the animal. It's minerals that replaced the remains of the animal and then solidified into a form of rock. Another type of fossil is called a preserved fossil. And in a preserved fossil, an entire organism isn't allowed to decay at all. And the reason for that is because when the organism dies, it's trapped in rock or ice or tar or amber. And so what you get is an actual living organism that has not decayed, that's trapped inside of another substance. Now, if you're paying attention, you should be able to answer a question for me. And here's the question that I have. Of these four types of fossils, mold fossils, cast fossils, petrified fossils, and preserved fossils, which ones do you think are the most valuable to scientists who are trying to study living organisms that lived long and long ago? All right, take a pause and do some thinking about that right now. So have you come up with an answer to my question yet? Which type of fossil, preserved fossils or petrified fossils or cast fossils or mold fossils are most important to scientists? Have you got a thought inside of your head? You know, I think it's kind of a difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure that I have the right answer, but here's what I would think. I bet you that scientists love to find preserved fossils because They have the entire organism to study. It's not just the external shell of the organism that they get to look at. It's not just the petrified remains of the organism that they get to look at. If a scientist could remove a petrified fossil from the substance that it's stored in, then we can study the DNA of that particular animal or organism that was alive at one point in the past. We can study the internal structures of the organism that was trapped in ice or tar or amber from the past. So a part of me wants to say that a preserved fossil would be the most valuable to study, simply because we get to see exactly what the organism looked like and study it internally and externally. But here's the thing. Petrified fossils, I said it wrong. Preserved fossils are the rarest type of fossil. They're the hardest to find. And instead, we tend to find lots and lots of mold fossils. So another part of me wonders whether or not mold fossils and cast fossils are more important just because we have more of them, which allows us to do more studying. If we had to rely only on preserved fossils, we would have a very limited view of what the fossil record really looked like, simply because there's not a lot of preserved fossils available. We don't find them all the time. But because we've got tons and tons of cast fossils and mold fossils, we get a much broader picture of what life was like during each period of Earth's geological time. I wonder if you agree or disagree with me on the notion that cast fossils and mold fossils are more important than preserved fossils in some way. So there are two other types of fossils that are worth knowing about. The first is called a carbonized fossil. A carbonized fossil forms when an organism is pressed between layers of mud and clay. And that organism will eventually, or that clay and mud will eventually harden, and it will squeeze away most of the decaying organism and leave just a layer of carbon behind in the rock. Remember that all living things, whether they're plants or animals or humans, have carbon inside of them. So a carbonized fossil is when the carbon imprint of a previous organism is left behind, squeezed together and left behind inside of a layer of mud or clay. Now, if you're paying attention, what type of fossil is most like a carbonized fossil? Did you say a mold or a cast fossil? Because that's what I think is probably the best answer. I think carbonized fossils are a lot like mold fossils and cast fossils. Here's why. In a carbonized fossil, we're really seeing again the external structures of that living organism. We're not seeing the actual remains of the organism, and we can't study it internally. But we can look at its external structures and draw some conclusions about the area where that fossil probably lived. Do you guys get that? The last type of fossil that I want to share with you is, I think, an interesting one. They're called trace fossils. So a trace fossil is not the body of a living organism. It's evidence of where the organism might have lived. So it might be a footprint left by an organism, or a trail left by an organism, or a burrow made by an organism. Do you get how that's different from mold fossils and cast fossils? So we're not actually seeing the body of the organism with a trace fossil. However, trace fossils give us lots of other information about an organism. We can see how it maybe would have walked over the course of time. We can see how long its stride was. We can see how it made its home, or where it liked to live the most. That's what makes trace fossils so interesting. It gives us information about how an organism lived, rather than just what an organism looked like. So I think trace fossils in that way are really pretty unique. Every other fossil that we've seen gives us a clue as to what an organism looked like, and a trace fossil gives us evidence about how an organism lived. to me, I think that's a really neat example or type of fossil. All right, and let's talk for a second about index fossils, guys. Index fossils could be some of the most important fossils on Earth, and here's why. Index fossils are used by paleontologists in order to determine the age, the relative age, of individual layers of rock. You guys know this and I think I can probably pull an image up for you. If we were to dig down into the earth, and sorry I can't talk and type at the same time, but if we were to dig down into the earth, we would end up seeing lots of layers of rock. Each of those individual layers is a layer of sediment that was left behind by a body of water over time. Now, if we look inside of those layers of rock, we're also going to find fossils within each of those layers of rock. That's how fossils work. Organisms are buried by sediment, and over the course of time, they become fossilized. So as we dig into a layer of rock and find fossils, one of the things that we would like to know is, how old is that rock? Because if we can determine how old a rock layer is, then we can also determine how old the individual fossils are within that rock layer. And that becomes really important to us as we're studying the Earth. If we want to know how climate has changed over time, if we want to know how the position of a continent has changed over time, then we have to be able to know the date of the rock that we're studying. And so index fossils help us to do that. Here's what an index fossil is. An index fossil has to meet 4 criteria. First, it's an organism that lives only during a very short part of the Earth's history. So it's limited in its time span. Second, we got to be able to find lots of that particular organism inside of the fossil record. You have to be able to find lots of them. That makes it a more useful index fossil to us. Next, we have to be able to find them over a wide area of Earth. They can't be from just a limited area of the Earth if we're going to make it an index fossil. And then it also has to be unique. So we have to be able to identify the fossil as a unique organism and not really find any matches. One other thing to know about an index fossil is that the shorter the period of time that organism was alive, the better. Because then when we find it inside a layer of rock, it really helps us to pinpoint the age of that layer of rock. If an organism lives over a long period of time, it's not useful to us as an index fossil, and the reason for that is because when we find it in a layer of rock, we'll have no idea how old that rock really is, because that organism lived over a very long period of time. Does that make sense? Maybe this will help. Let me show you an example of an index fossil. This guy's called a Trilobite. And he's not super fancy, but he is unique. It was a hard-shelled animal. Its body had 3 different sections. It lived in shallow seas. And it went extinct about 245 million years ago. And what that tells us is if we find trilobites in a layer of rock, and by the way, they're kind of easy to find in layers of rock because they existed in lots of places around the world. Trilobites were not an animal that was unique to just a particular area. We find them all over the world. And if we find them in a layer of rock, then what we know is it's likely that that layer of rock is about 245 million years old. Now, what else is interesting is that trilobites, just like any animal, changed its external structures slowly but surely over time. We call that natural selection. So an animal becomes uniquely suited to survive and thrive and reproduce in its own habitat, and over the course of time, it changes its body structures. So trilobites actually have some different body structures depending on the time that they were alive. And by comparing a fossil of a trilobite to other known fossils of trilobites, then we can make some predictions about the age of the layer of rock where a trilobite is found. Now, don't get me wrong, a trilobite is great and all, but in the end, what that really gives us the chance to do is also look at other fossils found in the same layer of rock and get an idea of when they may have lived too. Do you guys get that? An index fossil becomes sort of like a geological clock for us. We like finding trilobites, they're cool, but there's lots of them, they're not unique or rare. But what they provide for us is an estimated time or an estimated age for any other fossils that are found in the same layer of rock as the trilobite. Those are called index fossils. On the next slide, and you can kind of check it out, you can see a list of what some of the most common index fossils are. Again, these are fossils that are found across a broad area. They existed for a very short period of time, though. And what that means is if we find these fossils, we have a good idea of how old the layer of rock that we found the fossil inside of is too. And then when we find other fossils in the same layer of rock, then we can put a date on when those animals probably existed as well. Those are called index fossils, and they're a really important tool for paleontologists who are trying to date things and understand the age of things. That's how we can make predictions about what animals were alive at individual times. It's by using index fossils in order to get an estimate of the age of individual layers of rock that we're studying. Cool, right? All right, I've got one final task for you. This is a video about a particular fossil, and it's actually titled The Most Useful Fossils in the World. I want you to watch that video. Okay, so you're going to do that on your own. I'm not going to play it here for you. I want you to watch it on your own. You can get it or find the link to it inside of our slides. So open up the slide deck. I happen to be on slide 15 right now, so scroll right down to slide 15 and find this video, and then I want you to watch it. And in the video, the narrator makes a really interesting argument. She says that the conodont is probably one of the world's most important fossils. Now, on this slide, I've given you a picture of what conodonts are. They're not super interesting, right? Like, I don't even know what those shapes really are. So it's difficult for me to, buy into this notion that the conodont is an important fossil just because it doesn't look cool. Like, I want to see a T-Rex, right? Like, that's a cool fossil. But the narrator argues that this is one of the world's most important fossils. And what I want you to do is I want you to rate your level of agreement with that argument. Are you on Team Conodont? Like, do you think that a conodont is one of the world's most important fossils? And if so, why? Or do you disagree? Do you think that the conodont isn't a terribly important fossil? And then make a case for that. So you're going to rate your level of agreement with that argument that conodonts are important fossils on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, if you happen to be in my class, you're going to post your response on Flipgrid. So this isn't something where you're going to write out a response. You're going to record your response on Flipgrid. The link to Flipgrid, or the place that I'd like you to record your final response, is posted inside of Google Classroom. So when you're ready to make your case for or against the conodont, post your response inside of our Flipgrid. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. All right? Anyways, that was cool, right? So for me, I learned a ton about fossils while I was putting this material together for you. I'd never really understood why we cared about fossils. I knew that it was neat, but I didn't know why it was important. And now I think I have a better idea of why it's important. I hope you do too. All right, I'll see you in our next lesson.